I probably listened maybe from the beginning, like 20 minutes, I think. And then I also listened to clips on YouTube just that were suggested from the middle.
I see. For the Peterson
Yeah, Green.
Green. Okay, so the reason why I find this interesting is because I think Green and Peterson have differing pictures of the competence hierarchy or the dominance hierarchy, whatever you want to call it. And it kind of like comes out a little bit early on in the discussion, but it doesn't really, they don't really go further into it because Green just seems really agreeable and doesn't push back to what Peterson reads into what Green is saying. But to me, it seems like he's getting a bit short thrifted. Green is. So maybe there's more to say about that. And
He's getting what?
Short, is that the phrase? Short thrifted or
What does it mean?
yeah. I'm too tired to. He's basically he's not properly doing justice.
I see. Okay, yeah.
Claims that Green is making, and I think that there are some interesting things that Green is making.
I see.
So I was going to say, first of all, one of the claims is that the will to power, and we can try to unpack that, kind of motivates most striving, right? And
yeah.
And Peterson, I want to put this in context. Peterson oftentimes, as I understand it, has a conception of power that is very narrow, whereas I have a very wide conception of power, similar to what Foucault would say or something like that. So the way that I see Peterson's conception of power is kind of like brute force or something that's, motivated to impact negatively or rather than something that's constructive. Whereas it seems to me like Green sees it in a purely constructive, life affirming way. And I think that's the way that Nietzsche thought of it as well. So maybe let's start there with the idea of the will to power and like, what does it mean and how fundamental it is to human striving?
So whenever Peterson mentions Nietzsche's power, he makes sure he emphasizes that Nietzsche didn't use the power the way that modern, I don't know, let's call them postmodernists use it. I think every time at least when he talks about will to power, he emphasizes that. I think basically he thinks what Nietzsche meant was closer to something like what's that, Elan Vital, or some, as you said, a much broader sense of the word of the power, whereas the way that it's used nowadays is almost like force. It has to, I think there's an element of something being voluntary or not. I don't know how, but I think the negative power that you said Peterson sort of pictures is negative precisely because of it neglects that whatever that power is, the sort of agency in individuals. And I sort of agree with that. For example, I had a similar discussion here at work. And often, let's say if someone is a professor, they're like, oh yeah, you shouldn't do that because like, I have a power over you. And that sounded strange to me because it's not just power, right? It's not yes, technically you can fire me, but that's not the only reason I am doing what you say. There could be tens of other reasons why I'm here working with you, because like I like your ideas, or like I respect you, or like maybe I love you, or there are like many other dimensions other than the fact that I'm afraid that you can fire me.
Okay, but that's the afraid that he can fire you is only one dimension of power, let's say.
Right. Like, so would you then say these other things like love, the fact that, let's say, I have a respect, does that mean I have a respect for you? Does that mean you have power over me?
maybe, but I feel like this is interesting. But I want to backtrack a little bit because I think you mentioned agency, and I agree that if the will to power and elan vital, I love Bergson, the way that Bergson uses are connected. It has something to do with agency, and it has to do something with creative force. But what I'm going to suggest is that outward moving agency, that creative force that is always kind of transcending, or it's in the process of becoming, as Nietzsche speaks of, uh, that movement, that motion is frustrated by the way the world is. And what I mean by that is not the way the world is in a physical sense, but the way that it's organized hierarchically. And the way that it's organized hierarchically isn't this fair, purely this structure that's, delineated by fair relations and clear cut ways that you maneuver through it, but it's actually a very messy thing. So if you can imagine, if you will, a kind of like perfect mathematical graph where you can move up the graph through like certain, activation functions. And let's call that activation function like some competence that you have over somebody. And it's purely competence that determines how you move up that graph. Whereas picture rather the DNA as this messy thing. And that's the metaphor or the analogy that I would use for the dominance hierarchy. Yeah, competence is there somewhere, sheathed by all these other relations, all these other kind of forces that influence it. And there's all kinds of give and take relations, unfairness, all kinds of weird kind of like power relations that frustrates how one navigates it. And it's a very fraught terrain full of like mines. And I feel like that's how Green sees it. So Green sees kind of like egos as being a huge factor in how one's maneuvering through the competence hierarchy rather, or maneuvering through these kinds of rather these social ladders. It is full of these relations, these ego relations, these bruised egos that people can quickly become motivated to be against you, or they can be resentful towards you, or things like that. So yeah, what do you guys think about that so far?
Albert, do you want to say something? You're muted or what? Yeah, you are.
I've been muted this whole time. How long have I been muted for? Shit, guys.
Oh, you've been talking? I don't know.
No, well, Angela responded to me earlier, so I think something's been talked. No, I didn't talk throughout the. Anyway, I mean, it makes sense, right? Like, I think we've all experienced this. I think we try to be hidden from it, like,
I think it depends on the personality and probably the way that you've been raised. Some people are more cynical than others, but I don't think regarding the ego being a major player in those, let's say social games. I don't think Peterson denies it. I think Peterson's view is that in very abstract sense, if you would let ego-driven player, like 100%, let's say ego-driven player versus 100% competence-driven player, then I think Peterson would say that like by far the competence will win if you let it compete for infinite amount of time.
Okay,
I want to say that this is not just naive. I don't think he says it naively. I think he has this leap of faith that whatever the fundamental substrate of reality is, like he metaphysically believes that substrate encourages sort of the way or the right way. So that's
I don't necessarily agree with that. Here's where I will disagree. So let's say you have people that are very close in competence. Let's say they're in some really high level field, I don't know, physics or even molecular biology, right?
Yeah.
And one of them plays purely fairly. He's a very naive player. And another player, he's competent, or she's competent, or they're competent, but they don't play as fairly. They're willing to cheat, or they're willing to do certain things that cast that other person in negative light. And so it happens that their game makes them advance further. And from what I've been my 32 years being in the world, has I've noticed that that kind of game is, I don't know how common it is, but it is played and it is successful. And it does sully the terrain, so to speak. It doesn't make, it's not this like mathematical way of moving forward. It's very messy. And so it doesn't seem to me like reality necessarily rewards the Jesus figure.
Okay, so I think
However competent.
okay, so three things. First, that reality rewards Jesus. I think that's the bottom of the argument. I think the rest of the things we will talk about today depends on that. I think there are some people who believe that reality rewards Jesus.
But Jesus, what happened to Jesus? Remember?
Exactly. That's my second point. So then the question is, what do you mean by reward? Because Christians would argue that Jesus got the highest reward possible.
Well, Jesus, okay, so if you take it literally, Jesus knew, well, Jesus comes with the knowledge that he is the Son of God. He knows that he is going to come back. So all of that, it casts his sacrifice in some dubious light, as many commentators have noted, even though I don't necessarily, I'm not necessarily commenting on that. But I mean,
yeah, my point is different. I understand. Yeah, so I'm not expert in theology or anything. Like I am not in a position to discuss, was that the legit reward or blah blah blah. I don't know any of that. I'm just saying when you say that reality, for example, doesn't reward Jesus, look what happened to him. He got crucified. I'm saying that's not necessarily a bad reward. Like depending on your framework,
depends on how you define it.
Like, would you prefer to be Jesus or nobody in a basement who lives happily until 100?
Yeah, so I think there are certain people that are willing. I think as a species, right, we would rather not kind of like cast our heads above the rest, because what is that saying? It's not coming to me right now, but the person who basically stands out from the crowd gets struck, or something like that, right?
Sure.
So as a rule, most of us are not willing to do that. And there are some people, in some way, Peterson has done that, right? He's kind of like thrown himself into for something that he believes in.
I would say every recognizable figure in the human history has done that.
Yeah.
Can I say something?
Yeah, please.
So, I mean, I think we're missing another point that he mentioned, which is like, there's all these like utopian ideals of, especially amongst people who are very agreeable, right? To say like, okay, well, let's not compete with each other. Let's just like, we can all be kind of equal and cooperate or whatever. And like, like he's talking about like socialist societies or nonprofits.
Yeah.
But he's saying like, what happens then is like, you're actually removing competence. Like you're not allowed to kind of say that you're smarter than anybody. Like it's like, like if you're like in a real business, right? It's like, okay, I made more money than this person for the business, I get promoted or something. There's like a real like
metrics.
Yeah. Like he mentioned this, right? And he's saying like in a nonprofit, there's no such thing. You can't, there's no objective way to measure who's more influential or whatever. So it kind of ends up being more soft power. And he's saying this is when it starts to get like kind of corrupted, right? Because like, okay, now it's like, who gets on top? Well, there's no objective way to say, you're not allowed to claim that you're more important or smarter. Just kind of like whoever's better at manipulating the social kind of
this is whose view? This is JP's view.
This is JP. Yeah, this is JP.
Yeah. And my workplace, I guess, is in some way a case in point of that. Because even though there are markers that you could say, they're not kind of codified, or they're not formalized, they're not as clear as the ones in a business, for example, because there's a bottom line, right? The business has to stay afloat, so there's clear metrics as to who's performing the best. And so I guess the claim here is that once the metrics are obfuscated, there's no clear metrics of competence, then what happens is the whole game becomes, even the egos themselves are more confused, right? So it becomes, so the negative sides of the ego maybe come to the fore more so than they would in a place that's those metrics are more clearly defined.
Well, I guess so, but it's also, yeah, like it's all about ego and it's all about like these kind of strange dynamics, right? Where like you're kind of playing this game. So let's say, yeah, it's all about kind of positioning yourself to who has the most power currently, right? It's like, one person might be like sociopathic or something and like seeks power. And then the other winners are like, you're trying to like just like win their favor or something. Like it just becomes kind of like corrupt in a way, just like like you have no way of saying like who's better or worse, so it just becomes like this sort of like posturing and like all this kind of has more of a chance to
yeah,
kind of
I would say you can quantify that. I mean, so I'm gonna just make this analogy. For example, for the longest time, as the number of potential students increased, it became harder to evaluate them rapidly and then decide, adjudicate between whether they should go into university or not. And that's basically resulted in like a bunch of people working intentionally to come up with set of tests, like what's the best test to judge students. And then for some reason, I mean, there are good reasons, but it converged to multiple choice because it's much, you can automatize essentially every step of it in terms of evaluation. You just check the dark points and then you will evaluate the answers. But what happened over years, even though competence of a student correlates with those multiple choice tests, given enough time, the algorithm is basically the global minima is going to select for not the most competent student, but a student that is best at answering multiple choice. So when you select for, even though you hope that you will select for the competence, the fact that you're selecting for, like your way of selecting is this multiple choice.
So it's less generalizable. You're
Exactly.
selecting for who can game the system the best.
Exactly. And in Albi's example, for example, then if let's say you put a merit aside, or let's say you dilute it with something else, then inevitably, given enough time, the person at the top will not be the best at that merit. It will be that merit plus whatever this extra variable you added there. He had to navigate that. And as a society, we hope that whatever we add for that criteria, all of that is useful. None of that is useless. But for example, what's happening in many organizations is that because of these, let's say, I don't know, I call it compassion-driven rules, basically, they're optimized for something else. So inevitably, given enough time, the people you see at the top will not be, let's say, I don't know, best businessman or like best CEO. Or
not
like,
only that, though, the cost to people who are willing to put the effort, the time to gain that competence. And when that's frustrated, right, when the reward to that effort that's genuine and where that competence really is there, and the reward is frustrated, like on a massive scale socially, that feedback mechanism, that negative feedback is not good, right? Because it's not incentivizing the accumulation of competence, and a great deal of society relies on it.
yes.
Yep.
Sorry. Yes, but I think what you're saying is true if it's not obvious what skills you need to be on top. If it's obvious what skills you need to have to be on top, and if substantial fraction of the population is willing to train themselves in those skills, even though, for example, let's say you're picking for the best surgeon in the city, and somehow because of whatever reasons, to become a best surgeon, you also need, let's say, to respect pronouns. I'm just making it up. So only subset of best surgeons will be willing to do that. And then inevitably, the best surgeon, given enough time, there'll be a point where the best surgeon is not willing to do that. So you will lose that best surgeon. So given enough time, you will optimize essentially for the surgeon who can also do this X.
That already introduces a soft criterion, and the soft criteria can be many, right? Like in some ways to navigate these positions of, I guess, power or competence, you have to be socially able in some way, right? You can't be completely antisocial. But then you have other more arbitrary ways, right? The ways that companies they create these social barometers that are kind of, well, what do you want to call them? Like not quite genuine, right?
Yeah.
and so that what you're saying is that undercuts people who are. But here's a problem that I see with that. So I call it a problem of like relative competence. So yes, like somebody who's not even like in that field, obviously they're never going to be considered. But within like the pool of surgeons, right? There is no way of like is there a way of properly adjudicating who is the best, right? There's close competencies where if somebody plays that social game better, they get to advance faster, even though perhaps this other person who is like maybe slightly better than them doesn't, right? So the game is very complex in that way.
Yeah, so I think that even maybe purer example could be sports, because there you can see that, let's say there's a best runner and they are usually best for, I don't know, a few years. And then there's like something happens and some other person comes and becomes better. I don't think that's the fact that there is ambiguity at the very threshold is a big problem. I think players usually are willing to go with that ambiguity. They even like it. Maybe without that ambiguity, not many players would be willing to play the game. You see, I don't know, Usain Bolt, and you just give up on running forever. But because of that ambiguity, there's sort of this surprising element of the story. What is problematic is when that ambiguity is due to factors that, it's hard to judge, but like if there was some objective way of measuring it, whenever those ambiguity is not due to the skills required to play that game, that's when I think.
Well, that's exactly what I'm talking about. When the
Yeah.
ambiguity is completely extraneous to and the advantage that's conferred on those people who maybe they're willing to, I don't know, play a little bit, dirty, or maybe they're willing to do certain things just to advance, does in fact make the whole structure not as fair as it would seem. So I think competence is the backbone perhaps of the entire stratification of the dominance hierarchy, but along the edges, it gets very messy, and there's all kinds of games that people play, and you can see this even in other species with different evolutionary strategies, right? Even in mating strategies, right? That are sneakier and less forthright.
But they're usually minority, right? Even in that podcast, whatever was Green, he said something like 3% of the population is always psychopathic or something. So I think, as you said, even for game theory,
that's not psychopathic though, what I was describing. Like it's not.
No, let's call them bad players. Bad players that succeed. They're usually in minority by definition, because the game would not be possible if they were majority.
Yeah. There's a certain threshold of fairness that most people meet for sure, because otherwise the game would just collapse in and of itself.
Right. So I think basically Peterson takes it one step further, and he says it is possible to achieve a game where everyone is fair. You just need to take that leap of faith, and you can't be naive about it. So that was my third point that I didn't finish earlier. So when you said, for example, let's say there are two players, one is their close competence, one is naive, and the other one, cheats. Mm-hmm. So I think Peterson would say that, okay, the competent player is not the one who can't cheat. The competent player should be able to cheat. But I guess it will depend on the depths of his moral character. When he decides to cheat, it's actually towards.
It's not just the depths of the moral character. Like from the evidence, the sociological evidence, it's also the environment. So the norms that we follow are the norms that the environment kind of reinforces. So there are different types of environments that selects for different norms. So in my workplace, there are different norms than, let's say, your work.
I get it. Yeah.
Yeah, and it seems that people will conform to the norms, whatever they are. And sometimes, there are some norms that are unsustainable. I agree with that. And there's this threshold of unsustainability. But I think that there are environments that come close to that threshold without crossing it.
Okay, so regarding your argument about environments.
Because we know, right? These things have happened in Soviet Russia and Nazi Germany, like these.
Yes, of course. But I'm gonna quote from Nietzsche, and let me know what you think. So, paraphrasing, I don't remember exact words. but basically saying that the depths of moral character is revealed at forks of in the road where there are no rules to follow. So essentially, it's, I would say, is, I mean, if you stretch it, metaphysical argument that you have this apparatus that is supposed to help you to judge the situation and make a choice independently of what's your environment. So in the, like, by definition, the part that you act according to rules is not your morality. It's your environment. As you, that's the part you just said, that your environment sort of.
Yeah, the human being is malleable in terms of like what the general rules are.
Right, but then the question is, do you believe like there's something like that? Do you believe there's, you know, biological basis to making the right choice or doing the right thing?
Well, it's complicated, but we know that there is lots of flexibility in terms of social norms, like lots. There's huge variety of behaviors, right, that are observed. But in your thought experiment where you have the person where the rules are unclear, like we know most people seek their self-interest, right? Most people can barely even care about cyclists. Like most of the time, they're almost killing them. Like they just want to get to where they want to get to, and they don't care if, like they're always operating on the edge. I find, like even with traffic, or if you notice how things work, you're just a self-interested mechanism, right? And then you're trying to like also not get ostracized and basically get punished more than you want to be.
I understand.
If we consider, for example, something like Plato's Gyges ring, right? Remember that from Plato's Republic, where you put the ring on and sort of, I mean, you see, if I remember this, you don't become, you put the ring on and there are no social consequences. No one can see what you're doing, right? Yeah. So how would you behave if the judging eyes of the other, if there is no negative sanctioning from the social collective, how do you then behave? Oh, well, obviously most people, I think, will default to some self-interest, but I think there is also an inner moral core that they might.
Yeah, because like, you know, there are YouTube videos of there's like compilations of people saving other people, like just reflexively. There's like almost no, for example, people there. I remember this video, the person trying to throw himself under the oncoming train, and then this guy just like without thinking even runs, even at the risk of killing himself with this other guy, he still saves it. Or like there's the bus topples, and then everyone, like literally everyone, just reflexively responds just to.
That might be an aberration, right, of the guy running out, because you have a famous psychology case of, I forget the lady's name, but she was in New York. She was being either raped or murdered, and this was the effect where everybody deferred responsibility to someone else being that person who was going to stand up and do something, and the net effect was that nobody did, right? So in these cases, I think they're resolved kind of empirically by looking at what the statistical odds are, right?
Sure.
Yeah.
But my point is that I don't think, like, I'm not sure if people act most of the time selfishly. I'm just not sure of that, especially in modern age where, you know, most people have loved ones and most people are surrounded by their loved ones.
Well, I think anything that enters your sphere of care is your sphere of selfishness. So what I mean by that is you have a scarce amount of give a fuck, right, care that you can afford to give, and that's your sphere of selfishness, right? You give care to yourself, you give care to your loved ones. That's your sphere of interest, and there's a limit to that sphere of interest, right? And so otherwise you're busting up against other spheres of interest. And so reality is this, or even the social reality is this spheres of interest, kind of like Brownian motion kind of colliding against each other. But maybe we can direct the conversation towards the ego, because it's kind of an interesting thing, right? What I've observed is that, first of all, ego is healthy in the way that it's that variable, that complex variable that the organism instantiates to ensure that you survive, right? It's serving that function. So you don't want to destroy the ego, right? You want it to be at a healthy place. When is the ego the healthiest, right? When that creative force, that desire to assert yourself in the world is realized. And when that's somewhat pacified, then you are less likely to be resentful or utilize the ego in a negative way. So there are ways that the ego can be bruised in social relations, and there's ways that it can be bruised in like everyday interaction, but it can also be bruised in the ultimate sense of the evolution of the organism isn't allowed to transcend itself or isn't allowed to realize its highest potential. And society, I mean, like we can talk about ourselves as being somewhat fortunate. You guys are like, you know, not the norm, right? A lot of people's potentials are not realized. So society is very complex in that way. And so there's a lot of negativity that's generated because of that.
Because people do not manifest their true potential.
Well, everybody conceptualizes the good differently, right? So for example, I think for us, we're kind of attracted to similar goods, maybe in some ways, more intellectual, or I don't know how you want to define them, less
Right.
material. But there's many different ways how people conceptualize the good.
Okay.
However, yeah.
Can I interrupt? Sorry. So if I would force you to find a common denominator, what would that be?
Between who?
Everyone.
Well, that everyone is moving towards some good, right? And that movement towards the good is continuous with, it's on the survival flourishing continuum. That's what I would say.
So I'm asking it because of your earlier point that, you know, most people don't want to stick their head out. And yes, we have proverbs reflecting that. I forget, like the nail that stands out gets hit first, or like the head that stands out gets cut first, something like that. But would you agree that everyone has this inner desire to be unique?
To be unique.
Not everyone, I don't know.
Yeah, not necessarily, I would say.
I guess I have to sort of expand on unique. So do you think everyone has this desire of being significant?
Yeah.
Okay, so I think that desire of but basically, you know, like nobody wants to die like insignificant insect or something like that. Like the significance, I mean, I'm sure that a lot of phenomenologists talked about it, but basically I think that desire to be significant is sort of more gentle way of saying what Nietzsche said was will to power. So I don't think it's everyone has this will to, you know, conquer, expand, flourish even. I think it's the desire so that whatever they happen to be engaged in is worthwhile.
So if I understand you correctly, the way that Green puts it, this desire to expand or is rather really something else, which is the need to be significant. So You're saying the need to be significant is more primordial or more originary than that other need. But I would say maybe it's the other way around. I think that expansive property is built into the organism. Organisms is built into the organism. And because of our cognitive prowess as kind of a unique species, it manifests itself in the way it does in humans, right? Because how would you explain wanting to accumulate indefinite wealth? Like how would you explain that motivation?
Okay, so do you think the major motivation behind wealth is the wealth in itself or what it provides?
Yeah, it's just a proxy for status. So
Okay.
I think
Even I will go even further. So
ordinary gain, yeah.
do you think it's the status in itself that people chase or what it provides?
Well, yeah, status is a proxy for probability of survival. Like it's just like the higher the status, the more likely to ability to reproduce. and
Okay,
carry on.
but in modern society, I think you'll agree that it's beyond survival, right? Like people accumulate wealth and
Yeah.
status for other reasons because we solved survival.
Exactly.
problem.
And in my article, I say this is a residue of that mechanism. That mechanism is in us. We have solved it materially, but the way we're constituted, the kind of like genetic predispositions aren't attuned to that fact. So we can't stop, right?
Well, why not? Okay, like it. Okay, another perspective. So let's say if I solve the survival problem, and I have this tool that drives me, let's say, to survive, and I've solved the survival problem. You think it's going to be stuck in the loop trying to interpret survival into different things, or do you think now that survival problem is solved, now there's a room? Okay, I guess it depends on if you believe on agency or not. If you believe on, is there a free will? Do you believe in, let's say, divinity of human choice or not?
Well, I don't know about divinity, but I feel like free will as an intellectual conundrum is still unsolved. We don't know. I would be inclined to say that we have some sort of free will, but
Yeah, but I understand that we don't. I don't think we haven't solved that. It's just like we don't understand it. There are a lot of things that we don't understand, but we believe to be true. Like we don't necessarily understand how the single cellular embryo becomes a Einstein, not just mammal, specifically Einstein. But we know it's true. We know that Einstein came from a single cell.
it's pretty explainable how that embryo becomes Einstein. I don't know what.
No, that's why I said Einstein.
It's not equivalent to the. I don't see the analogy with the free will problem.
Anyway,
But
I think we're getting off topic a little bit.
yeah, we're getting a little off topic.
I guess maybe, I don't know if similar to what Dyke's saying, it's like, okay, so there's like status, wealth and all that. I mean, it could be just status and reproduction, but like I think it's more than that. It's like there's like the self-actualization part of it, right?
Mhm.
Like the more money and status you have, the more things you're able to do. Like, oh, like, do you want to own an island or fly a plane or whatever the fuck, right? Like you can always just like do more, like the more you have. Like, however, like you imagine your life should be fulfilled, like most people are going to be kind of weighted down by reality, right? But like the more of these things you have, the more you're able to actually like fulfill what you actually want to do, basically.
So you're saying that wealth affords more possibilities, essentially.
Yeah, like
Yeah, basically, right?
Yeah, and those possibilities, like conceptually, they're infinite in terms of like, because we have these imaginations, you can say, well, there's never going to be enough wealth. I want to go to Mars. I want to build a spaceship. And
Yeah, but people, if you notice, do you think there are a lot more people right now that can go to space that actually do? Like, I think like there are a lot more people who could buy a trip to the space, but they don't.
yeah, absolutely. Not everybody considers that as a good.
So exactly. So my conjecture is that if you look at people, if you sort of bin them based on how much wealth or status they have, and then for a given bin, you look at what they did, you will see variety of things. They won't, I suspect that they won't converge onto one thing. Why I'm saying this? Because if it was true that there is, one way of expanding and there's like one way of sort of achieving this primordial function of survival, then they should have converged onto doing the same kind of expansion.
Yeah. So my theory about that is what stratifies the spheres of competence is motivated like in a veiled way or by reproduction in some way, partially, right? But I think So let's say that there is a sphere of competence that you're not admitted to, then you can create your own sphere of competence, right? You can, a lot of like, you know, art or lots of things, they're just spheres of competence that like in the, you know, the personality trait that, you know, generates artists might have been useful in some sort of social typology, you know, back in the day. But I mean, like, you know, just generating art by itself, it is a sphere of competence that you can sort of is malleable, right? So the spheres of the, there is no ceiling in terms of like how many spheres of competence there are. I think it's open. So I agree with you there. But okay, so in terms of the definition of power, this is where I also wanted to come to.
Mhm.
I do think that agency is power conferring, and you can sort of realize agency is power conferring, and there is positive kinds of power. So when you have certain intentions and you realize them, that is very powerful. You feel really good about yourself. You bring something into the world, and I think that is a form of power. Whenever you are well, sort of, you're standing on a ground, right? Your ground is not sinking. That is a kind of power, right? And it's a good kind of power. You want more people to stand on that ground, even though you want limits to how they get there. So I think power is a very fluid thing, right?
Yes, but we should